I just thought I would tell you two stories of the last decade. The first story is one that might not feel familiar, and maybe in this group you might have heard it as much. The first story is that in the UK, from 2010 to 2020, the income in real terms per person went up. Not wages, wages stagnated, but incomes, which includes the money you get from investments, that went up. The total amount of wealth in the country went up massively. The amount of food consumed per person in the country went up. Actually, the number of calories consumed plateaued in about 2015, but that's more to do with middle class habits by spending more money on food, but it's healthier food. Nutrients, the micronutrient measures that you tend to associate with developing countries, all went up in the UK. And the number of bedrooms per person in the country went up. So I love the musical Chairs story. The thing is, there were more chairs, our arses got bigger. Is arse your favourite word now? In the 10 years of the last decade, poverty started at 13.1 million, it finished at 14.6 million. We don't have numbers for what happened since the pandemic. And we know, the reason I came in here rather flustered today was I was going through the numbers from yesterday's spring statement. Depending on which measure you use, poverty will go up next year by 600,000 or 1.3 million. Thanks to what happened yesterday. The amount of money spent yesterday, 18 billion, was sufficient to wipe that out. Instead, 2 out of every 3 pounds that was spent of that 18 billion went to the top half of earners. So that rise was a choice. Destitution, which is a form of poverty we didn't bother to measure in 2010, not because it had completely gone, but because we understood it. We understood the groups of people who experienced destitution, and we understood the pathways. So this sort of a cumulative measure, sort of a dashboard of it, wasn't needed. It was sitting at probably around 50,000 a year. By 2015, it was 1.5 million. Before the pandemic started, it was 2.5 million. And Trussell Trust. We start the decade feeding about 20,000 people a year. Last year we fed 2.5 million. We only represent about 60% of the food bank movement. Those two stories happened at the same time, and it's really hard to put them together. This is not a story about not enough resources. This is a story about distribution of resources. And this is not a story, just as he said, about personal failure. Unless you believe that in 2010 everybody lost their motivation to work, everybody became more feckless, drank more alcohol, which they didn't, we've got numbers on that. Unless you believe that's what happened, then the only place you can look is policy. The only place you can look is what policy changed. And really simply, it was welfare reform was the big driver. There's other drivers as well I'm happy to go into. But welfare reform was the big driver. Now the welfare reforms that happened in Britain in 2012 were actually modelled by something that happened, I'm sure, and we'll delight in this, was modelled by the Hartz reforms that happened in Germany a decade earlier. And during the Hearts reforms, food bank use went through the roof. And at Trussell, we saw welfare reform come. Just to give you one idea, in 2016, when universal credit arrived in an area, you saw a 53% rise in food bank use. In areas where universal credit hadn't reached yet, it was 13%. It was that system. So in Germany, we have these reforms, we have the food bank movement. And now the food bank movement is part of the welfare state. Just as they said, the food bank movement took government money, and it is now established and embedded. It is a way of getting support. And Trussell had a choice to make. Are we a charity that is about feeding people, or are we a charity that is about justice? Because justice involves people having food in their bellies. We're not going to stop giving out food. But justice also requires that people are not subjected to these policies. Justice also requires that people's voices are heard. So just as he was saying, these policies come from an idea. We're born in an idea. You've heard the term personal responsibility used quite a lot. That you must take personal responsibility for what happens. And it's this idea of a just world hypothesis. I don't know if any of you are aware of it. It's an idea, it's actually a very sort of Old Testament idea, and it's an idea that's sort of renamed in psychology. But it's an idea that the world as we see it must have arrived by some sort of just outcome. Because we feel better about the world if the world is just, if the poor are poor because they're worse, and the rich are rich because they're better. It's a much nicer world to be in. And the welfare policies are based around that premise. And there's a nice and there's a nasty way of designing it, or of conceptualizing it. The nice way, or the nasty way I'll start at, is you see they deserve it, it's alright, we can leave them. The nice way, which is the one that was articulated there, is what's wrong with you? Can I help to fix you? That's better, but it's not justice. The real solution is to find out how people live, learn the stories of people's lives, and design policies that fit them. And universal credit was the wrong policy designed by the wrong people to do the wrong thing. And its outcome is food banks. And if we want to tackle the injustice of homelessness and of housing, then you have to not listen, as he said, to middle-class homeowners. You have to not design a system which is fundamentally based around the idea that we supply housing in order to make a profit for someone, and in the vain hope that you can make these incentives point towards everyone having a home. That's never happened, and it never will. So the question is, how do you do that? And the answer is, I shouldn't be the one that has the answer. The answer is that we should invite others to develop an answer, and it won't be perfect, and it won't be ideologically sound, and it won't be pure, and it will be very messy, but at least it will have the benefit of offering people dignity. Thank you.